How did he happen to pick Harry Truman in '44?
He didn't, the fact is, he didn't pick Harry Truman. He picked Henry Wallace in '40, and he got into a big fight in the convention, almost lost the fight. One of the things that's in this book, he threatened, he had written out a statement declining the nomination. He'd already been nominated if Wallace didn't get nominated. And this is where Eleanor came up. Francis Perkins engineered a trip to Chicago from Eleanor. And Eleanor made a very calming speech. This is the speech that Doris Kearns Goodwin used as the title of her book, No Ordinary Time. And she pleaded with the convention to give FDR the man if he wanted. I'm sorry.
How did he get Truman?
Oh, Truman. Yeah. You know, when he picked Wallace, he was the first president or presidential nominee to actually designate who he wanted as vice president. Now it's commonplace for a presidential nominee. That was the first time it was done. But he didn't do that in 1944. There was a lot of unhappiness with Wallace in '44. And I'm not an authority on this because it doesn't cover it. I didn't cover the scope of this book. But the old Democratic Halls wanted somebody else. And the two alternatives were Wendell Douglas, who was then in the Supreme Court, and Harry Truman. And he basically let them decide and picked Truman. And thank God for Harry Truman. Very good choice. Yes.
The protection on the wall, does seem to say that Lincoln was guided by a very high moral sense.
Yes.
It's my understanding that even after the Roosevelt administration was made aware of what was happening to the Jews, particularly after 1942, and decided not to militarily intervene in what was going on in the camps, why was that decision made, and would Lincoln have made the same decision?
I don't know what Lincoln would have done. I have no idea. But obviously he was amongst the most moral of our presidents. In the story in FDR, it really doesn't kick in until 1941, and that's, again, not covered here. But I've looked enough into it because it's a fascinating subject and an important subject. And and you can get into a very polemic argument on this on either side. And what I've learned is, I just finished reading a book called FDR and the Jews. It was written by two professors at GW, American University. And it's a very good, balanced view. And basically where they come out is that yes, FDR could have done more, but he did more than anybody else in the world to protect the Jews. Probably not enough.
No.
But yes.
Well, by that same token, at the same time Lincoln was saying what's on the wall, he was sentencing 38 Native Americans to death in Mankato, Minnesota, even though they did not have a trial representation or any guilt in the massacre.
This is a story I know a little bit about because I'm from Minnesota.
Yes,
I'm part of the Minnesota lore.
Yes.
And
Would you repeat the question?
The question was about the hanging of 38 Dakota warriors in Mankato, Minnesota, after what was then called the Sioux Uprising. It's now called, more appropriately, the Dakota Wars. And there was great provocation for what happened. There were merits on both sides, demerits on both sides. But the fact is that about 500 or 600 white settlers were killed, as well as a large number of Dakota warriors. It traumatized Minnesota, absolutely traumatized Minnesota. They called regiments back to chase the Dakota into the Dakotas, and brought a lot of them back and tried them. And there was a semblance of a trial. I haven't looked at this. I don't know exactly how diligent it was or how accurate it was according to form, but a large number, I think up to 200, were sentenced to die. There was an Episcopal bishop in Minnesota by the name of not Kellogg, Whipple. Bishop Henry Whipple, who spent a lot of time with and working on behalf of the Indians. And he petitioned Lincoln to review the sentences. And Lincoln did apparently review every one of the sentences. And he commuted all of the sentences except for those 38 who did hang. And again, I don't know the exact date of this, but it infuriated the Minnesotans that so many Dakota warriors had been commuted. But I thought it was an act of great courage, what he did. And he had some legal basis. He would stay up late at night reviewing those sentences. So it's a very complicated issue and tragic. The whole episode was tragic. Yes, sir.
How much support was there for the congressional support for Lend-Lease, or more appropriately, how much resistance, given that the peacetime draft only survived by one vote, and that's with the Republican opponent not putting any resistance, thank goodness.
Yeah,
Good
question.
Yeah, how did Congress pivot there and not sabotage that?
Actually, the peacetime draft passed by a narrow margin in 1940, but you're right, it was renewed a year later by one vote in 1941. Roosevelt won the election, and he came up with the idea of Lend-Lease. You know, if you wanted to borrow your neighbor's fire hose to put give the hose back. And this was what he said would make America the great arsenal of democracy, and indeed it did over time. It was hugely controversial, but he sold this as a mandate that he had achieved. And actually, the person that helped him see it enacted was Wendell Willkie, who was a great statesman. He said, we only have one president, Franklin Roosevelt's my president. And he had always been for supporting Britain. And they had dinner together, just the two of them, on the evening before Roosevelt's third inaugural. It was a laughter was coming out of the room. He gave Willkie a handwritten letter to take to Churchill. He went over to see Churchill as his own representative, came back, said, I want to testify on the Hill. And he did this over the opposition of the entire Republican leadership, who were opposed to the congressional leadership. Everybody was opposed to this. And he was not uninterested in the nomination again in 44. As a matter of fact, he was very interested. But he ruined his chances when he did that. But he knew it because it was a matter of principle for Wendell Willkie, who, like Francis Perkins, is one of the great under-acknowledged people in our history. And it takes us back to a time when Republicans and Democrats could work together on really big issues and get things done. And so I'm a huge Wendell Willkie fan. So, yes?
Today we talk about red states and blue states. How regional was FDR's support, and if there had been universal suffrage in the South, you know, as compared to poll taxes and whatever, would it have been a close election at all?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I didn't get into the election in terms of, you know, he had put together what he called the New Deal FDR coalition, which is working folks, African Americans, liberals, farmers. It was the old coalition that remained the basis for the Democratic Party for a long time. To some extent still is, but obviously not to the same extent. Where he didn't win and where he was worried about the election was with the Irish vote, because they didn't like the support of Britain. Some of them didn't. And the Italian vote, because he was very hard on the Italians, who of course declared war on France and stabbed in the back and all that. So there were more ethnic votes. They were monolithic, but they were definable at that point.
And there were more New England?
Well, he carried the large industrial states, and I think he carried a fair number of the southern states. I mean, it was still the solid South of the Democratic Party for the most part, but he was very worried about that. And of course, that changed over time. Yes.
Prior to the 1940 election, Roosevelt, directed the FBI to essentially engage in what we would consider today domestic spying for the first time, really. Was there any, did that generate any controversy at all, or was it?
I don't think it was known at the time.
Or was it known?
It wasn't known at the time, but there were some surreptitious efforts underway there. This was in particular in regards to the war effort. Because the Germans were very active in New York, Washington, elsewhere. They had their agents at the Republican Convention trying to gut some language into the platform. And the British were over here doing just the opposite. So there was a lot of foreign intervention in our election that year, and obviously trying to get intelligence. So I'm not an expert on this, but you're right. There was a lot of activity going on, but I don't think it certainly wasn't generally known at the time. It became known later.
We can take one more question.
Yes, sir.
I'm sure your book covers this, but could you share with us a little more about Roosevelt's effectiveness in dealing with Congress, particularly with these two particular pieces of legislation? Did he interact with congressional leaders?
Funny how this question comes up. He had a pretty good relationship with Congress. I mean, he was a schmoozer. He would have them down to see him. And he consulted fairly widely with the Congress. He certainly did on Lend-Lease. But he stayed a little bit back on the draft because he thought that he would be a polarizing figure if he came out too strongly for the draft, because they were trying to get a lot of Republicans. And there were some Republicans sponsoring this bill in the House. But he had incredible political instincts and skills to deal with the Congress. Although he lost some of it because, in 1938 he attempted to purge some of this conservative Southerners, in particular, who had not supported his New Deal measure. And where he really got in deep water was with his court packing plan, because he never consulted anybody. And he paid a huge price. He was the biggest legislative defeat of his presidency. But he learned from that. He learned from that. Thank goodness. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you again for sponsoring this, Jim and David and Northern Trust, and Aaron. Thank you. And I just want to thank you all for coming. And so many of you are actively engaged in supporting this institution. This is a great place, and it can be even more relevant and more important. And it's always fun. So thank you so much.
Thank you.